The night fort breathed like an old beast, each gust of wind drawing a sigh through its broken jaws and out into the snow-choked courtyards where crows nested in the ribs of fallen beams. Jon Snow stood beneath the cold arch of the great hall, his lantern throwing a wavering coin of yellow over the cracked flagstones. The stones sweated in the winter, the old ones said. There were places under the wall where the ice wept and whispered. In the night fort, the water found its way up instead of down, ghosting the air with damp that set a man's teeth on edge. Nothing good ever came of this place, Dolorous Ed muttered, his breath fogging as he shuffled in behind. Kings ate their sons here, and sons ate their kings, and the stew never did taste of anything but old shoes. It was one king, Jon said. His voice sounded small in the vaulted dark. The lantern's light pressed forward a few paces and then failed, swallowed by black. And the shoes were well cooked, Ed said, as if this at least were a mercy. He held his own light low so it shone on his boots. If ghosts want to drag me to some rat's table, they'll have to trip me first. Best not speak of that tale, said the builder, Hareth the Hands, who'd come with them to judge whether the old place could be mended. Hareth had a broken nose and a busted ear, and a habit of listening more intently than other men. If walls keep memories, this hall's fat with the worst. Jon moved forward. The night fort had a way of turning a man's feet to iron. Even the Lord Commander's shadow seemed to balk and hang back, as if reluctant to follow where he went. The steps of the three men sounded too loud. The wind chased its own tail beyond the walls, and somewhere the slow plink of water marked time like a patient, dreadful clock. They made for the kitchens. The great hearth, black as the inside of a crow, gaped open, its lintel carved with faded serpents that might once have been dragons. The chimney mouth was so wide a bearskin could have been dragged up it, and had, if you believed the tales. Jon reached a hand into the soot, felt grit and old grease. The bricks were warm very faintly, as if the heart of the night fort still remembered fires. Hareth, Jon said, and the builder came to look with him. You see, Hareth touched the carved serpents. The stone here sweats. See the salt? Not just old fires. There's warmth inside the wall. The night fort was raised when men laid work like spells. This hearth ties to deeper tunnels. Where the gate lies, Ed said, naming it softly, as if to say the word too loudly would wake something. Jon had never told him what Bran had told him, the face beneath the world that opened only to the words of the oath. He could feel the presence of it in his bones, though. Not a thing you saw so much as a thing you sensed, like the way a dire wolf feels the storm long before the first flake falls. Jon set his lantern upon the stones. We'll look behind the hearth, he said. If there's a hollow, it may be sound enough to house a store or a barracks. Hareth grunted. There's a seam along the back, mortar newer than the rest. Whoever closed it did it in a hurry and never told a mason. They fetched pry bars from their satchels and set to work. The frost had gnawed the mortar to weakness, and soon the first brick came away in Hareth's big hands. Ed muttered prayers to any god that might be about as they levered more free. Jon felt the shift in the air before he saw the darkness inside the wall. Cold on his face and then, strangely, a touch of hollow warmth, the breath of a cellar that had kept its own weather. They widened the opening. Jon crawled through first, lantern in his teeth, his gloves black with soot. Inside was a small space enclosed by the thick stone of the chimney and a back wall of dressed slate. It smelled of old smoke and something else beneath, a dry, metallic scent that made him think of storms. His light slid over iron-bound timber, a coffer, long and squat, its corners reinforced with black iron. A clasp had rusted in place over a lock so corroded it looked ready to crumble. Chest, he said, and his voice came back to him close and soft. He hauled it forward an inch. It was heavier than the eye guessed. He ran his thumb over the lid. The iron had been fashioned in the likeness of a three-headed dragon, its snouts meeting at the lock. No stag or direwolf marked it. Once, a seal of red wax had been pressed above the lock plate, and traces of it clung in the creases like dried blood. The shape impressed on the wax was a wheel of swords around a crown. Harith squeezed in beside him and whistled under his breath. Targaryen work, by the look. Dolorous Ed leaned in to peer at the dragon's heads. One eye squinted against the falling soot. If that box bites, I'll be needing fewer fingers than I've got. They dragged the chest out into the hall where there was room to work, set it on 2 stones. Jon's knife pried the brittle lock apart in flakes. Harith did the rest with a chisel. The lid groaned as they lifted, leather hinges complaining like an old ant. The lantern's yellow reached into a world that had not seen light for a century or more. At first Jon thought they were looking at a chunk of stone the size of a man's head, smooth and black. Then the light caught the sheen on it, a deep, slow gleam, like embers banked under ash. Veins of dull red ran beneath the black, thin as hair and branching with the logic of lightning. The shell scales were so fine they seemed a trick of the eye, a pattern that appeared and vanished, as if the surface could not choose whether it was scale or stone. Ed made a sound somewhere between a prayer and a curse. Harith crossed himself from brow to breast. Jon did not move. Heat, the faintest kiss of it, breathed from the thing in the coffer. He was aware of his own heart, like a hand knocking on a door. It was an egg.
No chicken, no ghoul.
He knew it as well as he had known Ghost when the pup's red eyes opened the first time. He reached out and did not quite touch, his fingers prickling as if the air itself did not want him to. Beneath the egg lay a wrapped bundle of crackling skins. Jon eased them out and found a roll of parchment stiff with age. When he turned it to the lantern, he saw smooth, fine letters inked in a hand more elegant than any at the wall. The seal, when broken, released the faintest breath of scent, something like cinnamon long gone to Ghost. He read the words intently, not daring to blink too much, as if the ink might float off the page in the damp air. To the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, in the reign of Jaehaerys of that name, King upon the Iron Throne, with the goodwill and counsel of Queen Alysanne, comes this gift, given into your hand and keeping, to lie near the wall until the darkest night. Dragon's seed fares best near fire's heart. The old ones say the wall holds meaning as well as ice. This egg, black of shell and stubborn in quickening, is of Balerion's get, the last sired before his weariness took him from the skies. If it should wake, remember that dragons know no oaths but blood and fire, and set your hand accordingly. Burn it if you must and be quit of it. Keep it if you dare, for a day when the realm has no better hope. We remember the Night's Watch, so did our forebears. So shall our children, if they live to bear memory. There was no signature here, but at the bottom someone had set down 3 small sigils in the corners. A 3-headed dragon, a crown on a field of swords, and, to Jon's surprise, a direwolf howling, smaller than the others, sketched quick as a flourish. Jon read the words twice, then lowered the parchment and stood listening to the wind. He could feel the old castle awake around him, as if the night fort's broken walls leaned in to hear. If it wakes, Ed said dully, I'll be needing warmer small clothes. Balerion's get. I've heard worse oaths carved in privies. Queen Alysanne came to the wall, Harith said. She saw this place. Silverwing went with her. The old brothers sing of her whenever the ale grows sweet. He looked at the egg with the kind of pity men give wild beasts caged. We should take this back to Castle Black. Let Maester Aemon see it with his own eyes. Jon closed the coffer with careful hands. It made a sound like a held breath being released. He slipped the letter into his jerkin. We'll carry it ourselves, he said. 2 men to either side, slow and steady. And if the rat cook appears to help? Ed asked, as they hefted the heavy chest and stepped into the windy flaw between stones where the snow had wormed through. He can take my end. I've carried worse burdens, but few that wanted to eat the world. They made their way out of the night fort with the wind in their faces and the sky blown clean to bare cold bone. The wall loomed to their right, a vast simplicity of pale blue. By the time they reached the sheltered trail and trudged south toward Castle Black, the coffer had left black smears on their gloves and a weight in Jon's thoughts like a new star in a familiar sky. At Castle Black, They carried the chest through the yard while men looked up from their work as if a bell had rung deep inside them. The word ran ahead of John as words always did: dragon, egg, gift of queens. By the time he mounted the steps to the rookery, Stannis Baratheon knew more or less as much as he did. The king arrived at the same moment John lifted the coffer onto Maester Aemon's table. Stannis's cloak scraped the door jamb as he entered. The chill that came with him seemed to make the fires burn a little bluer. Melisandre followed. Her red silks glow warm in the tower of the maester that had always smelled of ravens, old straw, and the faint musk of parchment. "Snow," Stannis said without preamble. "What is this I hear about an egg?" John might once have knelt. He did not now. A chest sealed and placed in the night fort in the days of Jaehaerys. A letter says the queen placed it there for the watch, to be used if the night demanded. Melisandre's eyes fixed on the coffer as if sight alone could loosen its irons. "Show it," she said, soft and keen at once. John lifted the lid. The room changed. It was only a breath, the adjustment the human eye makes when light meets dark. But something in the presence of the egg drew attention the way a lit candle draws moths. Maester Aemon leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, as if to steady himself. Under his blind lids his eyes shifted, seeking the heat. "I smelled old smoke upon you when you came," Aemon said, his voice as thin as ice in spring. "I did not expect this. Bring it nearer." Stannis moved first. He stepped to the table and, with all the caution a man like him afforded delicate things, reached out and brushed a calloused finger along the shell. He drew it back almost at once. "Warm," he said. Melisandre's mouth had parted slightly. "Heat and ash, a black heart with embers asleep. I have seen such shells in Ashai sold by frauds and fisherwives. They were cold and dead and heavy as lies." She looked from the egg to John. "This is not a lie." John took the letter and read it aloud. The king listened without motion. When John reached the words of Balerion's get, Stannis's jaw worked once, as if he held a sour taste in his mouth. "Balerion, the Black Dread," Aemon said when the reading was done, and smiled a very small smile that did not reach his eyes. "I was a boy when my father took me to the Red Keep. They showed us the skull in its cellars. The eye sockets were windows. The heat in this room knows that skull. The black shells of his line were thick and slow to wake, even in the day when dragons hatched oftener than not." Stannis's gaze flicked to Melisandre. "You have said often enough that the Lord of Light works through fire and king's blood. Is there gain in this?" "A dragon wakes to fire and blood," Melisandre said. "Not any fire, not any blood." She smiled faintly in the king's direction. "King's blood burns bright, so does a prince's, and there are older ways than ours in this castle. Beneath us the wall is alive with its own kind of sleep." "Turn your riddles," Stannis said curtly. "Say what you mean." Melisandre inclined her head toward John. "The egg is bound to the watch by the queen who gave it. The boy who found it holds a key, though I cannot name the lock. I have seen a shadow of a dire wolf with flames in its eyes. I have seen a dragon the color of midnight. If it wakes, it will wake for him." "Convenient," Stannis said, and the word fell like a stone. John felt their eyes and tried to feel the steady line of his spine the way Ser Roderick had taught him when he was a boy. "Your Grace," he said, "Maester Aemon can testify to the letter. If the egg belongs to any, it belongs to the watch. What we do with it must be the watch's choice." "The choice of boys and murderers," Stannis said, "of outlaws and rapers." His mouth made a line like a drawn blade. "You sit with stolen crowns upon your walls. I need no egg to claim what is mine. But even I am not blind to what flies and burns in stories. You have a war south and a winter north," John said. "A hatched dragon splits the world, Your Grace." "Then you had better choose where the blow will fall," Stannis said, and his frown deepened as if he were carving reality with it. He turned on his heel and left, Melisandre gliding after him like the idea of heat leaving with the man. John stayed with Maester Aemon. Together they sat in the soft cawing and cooing of the rookery, the egg on the table between them. Eamon's fingers rested near it as if on the arm of a sleeping child. "Do they dream?" John asked low. "Dragons?" Eamon considered. "I think the world dreams them more than the other way. When the world is cold, it dreams of fire." His head tilted toward John, milk-blind eyes finding him as they always did with eerie precision. "You will be careful." "I don't know how to be anything else," John said. That night John dreamed the crypts of Winterfell and cold air that tasted of iron and earth. He walked down steps that seemed to go forever while wind muttered under the stone like a woman pleading with fever. He had no torch and did not need one. He knew the way. The kings in their stone crowns watched him pass with faces that were Ned's face in the way the dead are all kin to one another. The alcove of Lyanna's statue lay ahead, and a blue flower grew from a crack at her feet, bruised by frost but not dead. He reached out. The petals were cold as melted snow. There was a sound then, a heartbeat made of hoofbeats and feathers and wing beats, and John woke with his hand on empty air. He rose and went to the tower of the Lord Commander. He climbed the last steps to the roof and stood while snow fell around him quietly, the sort that seems not to fall from sky so much as leak out of the world. Ghost sat beside him, red eyes reflecting whatever light there was. Far off to the south a wolf answered a second set of wolves, or else it was only the wind through a split tree. John set his hands on the parapet and watched the dark. He thought of Eamon's words. Burn it and be quit, keep it and dare. A lord might weigh those choices like coin. A brother of the watch had only an oath and his best sense. He imagined the egg lying in the coffer like a heart in a chest, old and patient as a winter under stone. "Fire and blood," he said to the snow. "I have both." In the morning he ordered the pyre built. It was a careful thing, set up in the yard between the armory and the old sept that Stannis' queen had made into a hall of her god. The queen's men frowned to see the wood go to a fire that was not theirs. They frowned harder when John had the builders lay out a bed of charcoal and iron nails, then layer pitchy pine over that, then dry peat to hold the heat. He told no one of the letter's phrase, but it sat in his thoughts like a song. Dragon's seed fares best near fire's heart. The heart of the wall was not flame, but the wall remembered warmth in some mad old way. Maybe that mattered. Maybe all this was foolishness wrapped in a noble wrapper and called courage. He had built with fools and nobles both and knew how alike they sounded. Queen Celis herself came to stare with pinched disapproval as the men stacked kindling. "This show is unseemly," she told him, clasping her hands tight on her rosary of carved flames. "If you must ape the rites of the true God, at least adopt the dignity of his temples." "We'll light no idols," John said. "No god asked for this fire. Lawler asks for all fires," Melisandre said, stepping out from the queen's shadow as if she had been waiting there. "As water belongs to the sea, so flame returns to him." Her eyes went to the chest hearth, the hands set near the wood. "Have you decided, Jon Snow?" "I have," Jon said. "If this thing wakes, it will wake in sight of the wall and under the eyes of men who swore the same words I did. And if it does not," Melisandre said, "then you will learn something about the way riddles fall silent." Jon dipped his head. "Watch with me, or curse me. But do not seek to bend my hand once it's raised." The queen withdrew with a sniff, muttering about obscenities and waste. Melisandre lingered. When she moved away too, it was like a coal being drawn out of a brazier, cooler all at once. Jon set the egg in the pyre's heart. It felt heavier than when he'd lifted it in the rookery, as if it had been drinking weight from the air. His gloves could not quite keep the warmth of it out. He nestled it in peat and pitch and settled a stack of resinous logs around it so the heat would hold. Then he slid his left glove off, pulled his dagger, and laid its point against the meaty part of his right palm. It saw and sucked in air through his teeth. "You're going to bleed on it? Is there nothing you won't feed?" "Everything I have came dear," Jon said. "This no less." He drew the point along the line where fortune-tellers claimed to read lives. Blood welled up, bright and hot, and when it fell it smoked on the black shell and ran along the veining as if it knew the way. John clenched his fist again and again until he had salted the egg with himself. Then he wrapped his hand and said, "Light it!" Melisandre did not move. To John's quiet relief, it was Othel Yarwick who stepped forward, grizzled and grumbling, and lowered a brand to the kindling. The peat caught slow, a sullen red that deepened to orange as the pitch found tongue. Smoke rose, black and sweet and thick. Heat struck John's face and licked the hair at his wrist. He did not step back. The men around them did. Even Ghost retreated a pace and laid his ears flat, eyes never leaving the heart of the fire. The wood whispered as sap went to steam. John watched the egg vanish in flame. He did not breathe until his body forced him to. The smell of pitch and hot iron brought tears to his eyes. Time turned strange, thin and wide. The world shrank to a sound. A steady, insistent tick like something inside a wall. Then the crack. It was not loud at first. It was a sound in the belly, felt more than heard, the way a man feels thunder through the soles of his feet. Melisandre's mouth parted. It swore creatively, softly. Heat washed them, flung like a cloak. The crack became a fissure. The fire changed color without warning. The orange swept aside by a heart flash of white so fierce it threw stark blue shadows. The pyre slumped as the inner heat devoured the heart and reached for the edges. Another crack, this time like a sword striking marble. The egg split along a line that had not existed a breath before. Something moved inside the shell with the eye. Resistible economy of newborn things. The shell burst and fell outward like leaves rained on in some other season. Flame drew in around a small, hideous, perfect thing that uncoiled with a concertina ripple and shook itself as if offended, and opened eyes that were the exact color of old coals. It was not large. Its body would fit in the bowl of a man's helmet. Its wings, when they spread, were long for that weight and stained like smoke. Black as slick river stone, it seemed more absence than presence, save where the fire picked out the polished ruby of claws, the dull garnet of teeth. It hissed, or perhaps the fire hissed and attributed its voice to the thing within it. The hatchling blinked once, twice, and the pupils narrowed to knives. Men fell to their knees the way a field of wheat bends under sudden wind. Others fled. John moved forward. He could not have stopped himself. His burned hand ached from heat and the way he held it close to his chest. The hatchling swung its head toward him with a quickness that made his heart jolt. When he lifted his bleeding hand and held it out without thinking, the dragon came. It climbed the blistering air as if it were a staircase, put one hot foot upon his fingers, another upon his palm, and set its small razored mouth to his wound. Ghost snarled, a single sound deep in his throat. Then he quieted as if reminded of some old pact. The dragon drank. His tongue, John had assumed it would be coarse, like a cat's, was a silvery, slippery thing that probed the wound gently. After a time, the pain receded or changed, became something less sharp, more an ache with purpose. When the hatchling had done, he lifted his head and regarded John as if to mark where the blood had come from. Then he climbed up John's wrist in a sliding scramble of tiny hooks and sat upon his shoulder as if he had lived there all his life. Heat poured off him. John smelled singed wool and his own hair scorching, and grinned despite the sting. The men around him stared as if he had grown a second head. Melisandre smiled like a woman who had seen a clear sunrise after months of cloud. "Balerion seed indeed," Maester Eamon said from where he had been brought in a chair and wrapped in furs, his face lit with a young man's pleasure for a heartbeat. "I was wrong to leave," he whispered to no one in particular, and John felt something tear very gently inside, as if an old thread had been plucked free. Stannis came. He did not kneel. He took in the sight and then looked at John as if measuring armor. "Well," he said, "there were those who called it a folly." His eyes went to the little dragon. "Is it clever?" "It is alive," John said. "It is a sword," Melisandre said, never taking her eyes from John. "And the hand that holds it has been tempered." For days Castle Black lived in a hot, improbable murmur. Men came with meat and left their fear behind, then returned with more meat and more questions. The hatchling, who answered to no name at first, caring nothing for the sounds men made. Grew by the hour, it seemed. He learned to snap charred flesh from bone and to pull back when he tasted John's skin. He learned the sound of ghosts' low warning and treated it with the respect a small thing gives a larger that will not eat it. He learned the Black Tower's rooftop and the crooked parapets where ravens liked to stand and comment. He learned the pitch of John's voice when John said no, and the pitch when no did not mean no. He learned to chase sparks as the forge spat them, and to lash his tail when he was angry, and to settle like an untrusting cat when men who were not John came near. Teach it to come by whistle, Harith advised, watching it pick the last bits of burned fat from a rack of ribs. Teach it to answer to a word. Men trust what answers to them. It's not a hound, John said. It's less than a hound today, Harith replied with the bluntness of builders. But it won't stay small. Teach it to tie itself to your hand while it will learn. Else you'll be teaching it with fire when it's too big to mind. Melisandre came and went and came again. She watched with an attention that seemed to heat the air. John felt her eyes on him as one feels a lamp on the skin. He kept the dragon where men could see him, and not only the queen's men. He fed him in the yard, on the tower, in the mess hall, one night on the Lord Commander's table with Night's Watch brothers gathered about and laughing with fear. Ed held up a piece of meat with 2 fingers as if he held a dead man's toe. The hatchling rolled out a guttering thread of fire no longer than a belt and charred it black, then ate it delicately. Useful, Ed said, shaking his hand, his eyebrows singed. I've always said I needed a kitchen maid who belches fire. I didn't say it loudly for fear someone would hear. And now see. Bowen Marsh watched, not laughing. Othel Yarwick watched with a complicated expression and drank. Satin reached out a hand and touched the dragon's head, and then yelped when the hatchling, quick as a snake, drew blood from a finger. More sense than most, this one, Tormund Giant's Bane said from the doorway, grinning under his beard. He had come in from the West Ridge with a skin of sour goat's milk and a story about a grove of trees that sang when the wind went through them. He knows your brother's fingers shouldn't be meddling where they aren't welcome. John looked down the table at the men whose eyes he needed to hold. Bowen with his guarded silence, Othel with his drink, Marsh with his old hurts like bruises that never quite faded. He felt the way the dragon's claws settled through wool upon his shoulder. He would have named the thing then to make it less a rumor and more a fact. Names bind, names anchor, night's work, Ed offered. Burn belly, said Yarwick dryly. Shadow wing, Satin suggested, then bit his lip as if he feared mockery. John studied the slitted eyes, the long, smooth skull, the glossy hide that drank light. He thought of the letter. He thought of the place the egg had slept and the hour when it had woken. He thought of the night that lay ahead of them all, and the night upon which this creature had arrived. The Balerion in him, inherited from a father he had never known and a grandfather he had despised in stories, rose to his tongue like an old flavor remembered. Nocturies, he said aloud. The dragon cocked his head, curious at the sound. His pupils narrowed further. A dry, almost amused chirr came out of him, like a bell rung somewhere deep. Nocturies, John repeated, and felt something settle. A name had weight in it. It made a place in air where there had been none. Word traveled. It always did. In White Harbor, a man swore to Wyman Manderley that a black dragon nested upon the wall. In the Dreadfort, an old woman picking embroidery from a ruined standard said the smell of smoke from the north made her eyes sting as if she were young. In Skagos, goats stamped and bellowed at the sky at odd hours and would not be coaxed indoors. Far to the east beyond the sea, a woman with silver hair dreamed again of a skull as big as a hall, and of a boy with a sword like a shard of night, and woke with tears on her face that smelled faintly of cinders. She could not say why. At Castle Black, the king returned to his demand like a hound to a favorite bone. You cannot keep it and pretend to be neutral, Stannis said in Jon Solar as dusk came earlier than it should. A dragon is declaration. It says what you will be. Then let it say I will be a shield, Jon said. The wall is not a sword. It is a place where swords break. The wall, perhaps, Stannis said. Men are men. A man with a dragon is a king in any land he flies over. I offered you Winterfell without a worm under it. Now I offer it with fire on top. Take the name and the hall and the place beside me, and the realm will do as it should. Refuse me and the realm will go on doing as it does, which is to say badly. He spread his hand as if the case were proven. My vows hold, Jon said, and if they break, it will not be because I wanted them to. Stannis's eyes had the terrible dignity of stones. Vows were written in hope. Winter knows nothing of hope. Make the choice for men who do not have the luxury. He turned and went, his cloak rasping like a page turned in a heavy book. In the days that followed, ravens spoke of Hardhome. A black-winged column arrived one after another, dropping words like hail on the rookery's stones. The dead walked in the ash of old cookfires. Children froze in the arms of mothers who had run out of songs. Men stood on headlands and stared at a sea gray as galvanized steel and saw shapes moving out there where things had no right to move. Jon spread the messages on the table. The ink jittered from cold hands. The words told a tale he already knew. Fear and hunger and the slow, certain calamity that moved with no more haste than ice melts in autumn. He remembered the map in the old hall at Winterfell, the little carved men representing hosts moving over it as if they were facts as patient as geography. Hardhome was a word the South laughed at. Beyond the wall, it was a word men said with a glance over the shoulder. Ships, Jon told Yarwick and Marsh, will send as many as Eastwatch can spare. Othell said, if they can land through the drift ice, if there's not a witch fog to swallow them. Men who go east in winter rarely come back with more than stories. Then I'll go, Jon said, and Othell's mug paused halfway to his mouth. Lord Commander, Marsh began. I am sending men to die if they go alone, Jon said. If I ride Nocturies above the ice, we can scout runs for the ships. We can set fires to mark landings. We can put fear into things that haven't known fear since the world was young. Or wake more than you put to sleep, Marsh murmured. I don't sleep as I ought as it is, Jon said. Tormund laughed like a landslide. I'll come, he said. I'll bring the Sinji trees to sing us a pretty path along the shore. If your worm drops me into the sea, I'll spit it back and ride the waves. They went as the sun held low in a sky that would not quite own up to day or admit to night. The ships crept along beneath, stout cogs and a few long, thin raiders from among the free folk who had bent their heads to new rules and old cold. Jon mounted Nocturies on the top of the wall, the dragon crouched and ready, the wind worrying his wing membranes until they thrummed like tight ropes. The first time Jon had climbed onto him, the heat had driven tears from his eyes. He had learned now where to lay his legs and how to curve his feet so the claw of the dragon's shoulder hooked against his boot and held him as neatly as a siege hook. Boiled leather and oiled wool protected most of him. The rest he left to the gods. Fly safe, Melisandre said, who had come to watch without being asked. Her hair had ice in it that did not melt. She put her hand over his bandage, which he wore now like a black glove from wrist to knuckle. It had healed burn scar hard and ridged in the weeks since the hatching. Your hand remembers the way fire talks. Keep listening. I'd rather listen to the wind, Jon said, and the Red Woman smiled as if wind and fire were cousins and had always been on the same side. He spoke Nocturies' name. The dragon turned his head. He had grown in the weeks like a story that improves with telling. He was not a horse, he bore weight differently. When he unfurled his wings, the world under them seemed briefly smaller. Jon felt the tightness in those wings with his thighs and calves and, maddeningly, somewhere in his chest as well, as if the dragon's body extended into him in fonts he had never suspected he had. He leaned forward and something in Nocturies leaned with him. The dragon crouched, leaped, beat. They rose like a curse leaving the tongue. The top of the wall fell away. The world opened. The cold found Jon where the dragon's heat could not reach. Snow whirled up past them in eddies like smoke running backward. Castle Black shrank to a scatter of toys and men to the black stitching upon them. Nocturies took 3 hard strokes above the wall and then flattened his wings and slid along the air as if he had laid his belly upon glass. John had imagined the feeling would be terror and joy married. It was something stranger. The fear had already been paid on the first leap. The joy had been bought at the first uncertain clamber off the wall stones. What remained was a thrilling, practical attention to the world below. A crack in the sea ice was a mouth that would swallow ships. A whiteness moving upriver against the current was not wind. A black line across a drift line meant stones or wood or bodies. John saw all this with the eyes of a hawk and the concerns of a man who had planned for the tide since midnight. Hardhome lay like a jaw full of broken teeth gnawed by the sea. As they approached, John saw smoke in odd places. Lines of it across the beach where something that had been a wall had burned. Smudges of it out on the ice where men had tried to keep the dark back and set their own light to defy it. Figures moved. Too many, too many. Ants with spears in a spilled grain bin. The ships below beat their oars and kissed ice floes and cursed the black frost that formed in their beards and brows. Nocturies smelled what was on the ground and roared. It was not a large sound compared to those made by grown dragons in old songs, but it was a true sound. It had the hard core of one thing turning into another and being hungry while it did it. The roar leapt off the ice cliffs and ran along the shore and set ravens from their roosts in a mad, revolving panic. Whites turned their empty faces upward. John's stomach knotted. It was always worse seeing the thing up close. Bodies that should have been buried in whispers of respect were walking meat under a different master. He saw a woman with a broken jaw carrying a boy who still had milk on his lips. Her jaw worked as she moved, worked and worked as if it were trying to remember speech. A man whose back was a black lace of old lash marks moved with the lightness of a spider over the boulders. At the edge of the village proper, the snow had been trampled into a pink slush where men had died and been raised before the blood finished cooling. Among them, still as stones, stood others. John saw the air distort slightly about them, as if it wanted to move away. Their armor was a mosaic of odd colors that only looked pale at a distance. Up close the ice made 100 tiny rainbows where the low sun caught it. Their blades were long and slender and looked as fragile as icicles and cut as if they were thought itself. Nocturies banked. John felt the dragon's heat increase as the little furnace in him woke to work. He tasted metal in his mouth as the dragon pulled air deep to feed the fire. Now, John said, because a man always said something at the first, even if only to pretend he had control. The dragon answered with a blast like the sudden door of a forge flung open. Fire flowered from his throat and struck the nearest line of dead. Whites went from fighters to fuel in a breath. The smell rose like the breath from a midden lit in plague time. John clamped his mouth shut and leaned so the gout of flame fanned where it would do the most good. Fire and shadow chased each other across the beach. Whites fell. He swept the dragon wide, set the ice itself singing as heat met cold in a strained, shrieking choral. Cracks ran under Nocturies like script writing itself on the sea. The others did not burn. John saw the fire touch the air a handspan before them and spread around them as if something invisible stood between. He swore. He had not truly expected fire to kill them. He had hoped. A hope had died. A truth had been forged. He locked it into his chest with all the other uncomfortable truths he had gathered since boyhood. He took them around again and again. Ships eased in where they could. Men staggered onto them. Ragged wildlings with butchered faces and braided hair. Women with babes in furs that smelled of goats. The old and the too young. Tormund laughed as he dragged a screaming man onto a deck and then struck him unconscious with a blow and carried him aboard like a sack of flour. The dragon's fire opened a space and laid down a low wall of char that would not be passed until the masters beyond it willed their dead to do it and paid them for it in whatever dread currency they used. Then something changed. John felt it before he saw it, the way a hound feels a quake before the ground shifts. Cold bit him up through the soles of his boots where they rested against the dragon's scales. Nocturies hissed in complaint, his pupils going to needles, his wings giving a small, involuntary shiver. Out on the ice, not yet within flame's reach, one of the others raised his or her long, brittle sword and made a small, delicate cut in the air with it. The cut did not close. It opened further. John saw his own breath plume out and fall in flakes. He felt the fire in Nocturi's answer with a desperate, fierce redoubling, as if someone had tried to draw heat from the dragon's belly with a straw. "Up," John said, and the dragon, bless him, obeyed. A spear of clear, cruelly glittering ice drove through the place they had been an eye blink before and shattered upon the cliff face. The shards sang as they fell. John tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue. He thought very coldly, we have their attention now. On the shore, a new sound rose. Not a scream, not a howl. A thin, endless note, like a wire being pulled through a hole forever. Men stumbled and wept without knowing why. John's heart tried to climb his throat and go to ground somewhere behind his tongue. Again, John snarled into the cold, to the dragon and to himself, and set Nocturi's in a low, sidewise slide across the strand, gouting fire at an angle so it sheared through the press of whites like a scythe through a dry stand of wheat. Flame met cold and fought it with a noise like a blacksmith's curse. Men cheered, hearts pairing with that sound as if it had been their old mother's voices calling them in from play. He did not see the second spear until it was flying. He felt Nocturi's twist, a whole-body coil, a wild buck that was all wing and fewer brains, and then a shock ran through John's legs up into his gut, savage as a kick. The dragon screamed. John smelled his blood. It was not like a man's, hotter with a bite in it like green apple. The spear had grazed the tender skin where wing met shoulder. The cold that came from it clung even after the shard fell away. Nocturi's left wing faltered. For a heartbeat they dropped. Longclaw had no comment to make. John did. He leaned into the right wing, his weight a plea. Nocturi's answered, "Clever boy, clever beast," and rolled them in midair as a trained dog might roll to scratch a flea. The fire came and went again and came. Tormund's shout reached him even over the hiss and crackle of their work. The ships were pulling out, heavy with the living. Dead men walked into fire and fell down and rose again into it and kept walking until their limbs failed in ways even sorcery could not command. On the edge of John's sight, the others moved with the patience of empire. They might have fought until the dragon bled out in the cold and John fell into the sea and men told that story for 3 winters. Instead, a horn blew from Eastwatch, faint and dear. It meant Icewind. It meant the weather that kills ships. It meant the bay would be a scatter of panes and broken timbers in an hour, and all their flight and fighting had bought what was buyable and no more. "Enough," John said, so softly. Why, he barely heard it. They left hard home to the dead. They dragged the living back across a sea that tried to become stone under them. The dragon limped in the air so that John's teeth rang with the rhythm. When they made the wall again, men waiting on top wept at the sight of them. One bellowed in a joy that rattled ice and made snow fall from ledges onto the yard beside the armory. The wound was shallow. It had looked worse in the air, as blood always does. They set Nocturi's in the warmest place Castle Black possessed, a corner of the old mews where the thickest stones remembered the hearths of a time when the watch had had more fires than men to watch them. John held his head while Harith and a wildling woman Tormund vouched for drew the spear splinter out with a pair of iron tongs heated to yellow. The dragon bit John's thumb hard enough to draw more blood than was kind, and then looked ashamed of himself in a way that said he would not be ashamed next time. "He learns," Harith said with dry approval. "If he lives, he'll be a terror." "He lives," John said, because saying it made it true. He slept at last in a chair with Ghost's head on his knee and the dragon's breath washing hot over his shoulder, damp as a dog's. He woke to a note in the air that told him winter had set another step down upon the stair, and to a letter, pink wax, ugly, big, badly written. The words crawled over the page like worms, but their meaning had teeth, bolt in hand or some draft of it. The man called himself the Lord of Winterfell and demanded his bride back, and named the hostages he had, and threatened the rest. He named the black dragon at the wall your little worm, which made John smile despite himself. He named Stannis broken. He named fear, and there was nothing little about the way men who loved him read it. He set the letter down. The blood of half the north seemed to throb in it like a pulse. The room was very warm. The warmth had a head and claws. "You mean to go?" Marsh said, white about the mouth. I mean to answer, John said. In some fashion. You swore, Marsh whispered. And there it was. The thing one man says to another when he has nothing left but words and does not understand why they are not enough. John nodded. He thought of his first set of vows, spoken with a boy's certainty and a boy's hunger to be a man. He thought of all the times since he had held fast or failed or bent and then unbent himself. He thought of dead children at Hardhome who would never know what a vow was. He thought of Winterfell's crypts and a blue flower in stone. My vows died with me, he said very quietly, and Bowen Marsh frowned, not understanding. John held up his palm with the burned scars, the place where the dragon had first fed. I gave myself to fire. I died in kind and was born by it. The watch made me and did its work through me. It can release me if it has mercy. He looked at Marsh a long time. Do you have mercy? Marsh did not speak. When he left, he did not slam the door. John would have preferred the slam. He made his choice as men do when the choice has made them first. He called Tormund and a dozen of the free folk chiefs who had bent their heads without breaking their necks. He called the Queen's men who had not yet scurried south after Stannis when rumor said ruin and the gods said nothing. He called Hareth the Hands and Othel Yarwick, though he did not know whether either would come. He called the builders and the smith and Ed and Satin and a boy from the kitchens who had carried meat to the dragon every day and spoken to it like a cat. He told them what he meant to do, to take those who would fly with him and those who would walk and ride and sled, to answer a letter in the only language the Dreadfort might read. He would burn Bolton's storehouses without burning his men. He would scare his horses. He would pluck his banners down and set a black shadow across Winterfell's walls for an hour, no more, and leave again without giving the man a battle he could win. He would do it as a Stark who did not claim Winterfell, and as a Targaryen who did not take crowns, and as a brother who was not one. He would do it as a man who would not watch more dead made when he could prevent it. They argued with him as men who loved him argue when they know his mind is made and wish to test the posts at the corners to be sure they will not blow down at the first gale. You'll set half the north to running, Othel said. Some to you, some from you. I know, John said. You'll show the south what lives on the wall, Tormund said with a grin. This I like. Let them know the winter has teeth and we're teaching it to bite where we say. You will need a banner, the kitchen boy said earnestly, and John could not help it, he laughed. In the end, men will go with a man they have decided to go with, and you will not know why entirely until years later in a quiet room with the fire low and your own hand shaking on the mug. Enough went. Some because they believed, some because they wanted to see a dragon fly over Winterfell, some because they were tired of letters written in pig's blood and wanted to answer in a hand that left no doubt. They went at dawn in a wind that made the walls sing like a great instrument. The sky took on a pale ivory and then accepted a faint wash of pink. Nocturnes, healed enough to fly, preened his wing carefully and regarded the world with one eye, then the other. He had learned the word go in several tongues and tones. He preferred John's. They flew south. Men on the King's Road stopped and shaded their eyes and forgot what they had meant to say to each other. In the Wolfswood, deer bolted without seeing them, their ears laid flat by the noise and the shadow sliding along the snow. They saw the towers first, then the wall that held warmth within like a pot set beside a hearth, the smoke that rose from Manderley's kitchens and from the barracks, the small figures that were men pacing. They saw Winterfell. He would not burn the weirwood. The thought shamed him, as if he had briefly considered drying socks at a sept's altar. He would not burn living men who had not met him in open field. He would burn the thought of safety, the idea of invulnerability, which men like Bolton wore as others wore cloaks. When arrogance is dry as tinder, a spark will do. Nocturnes roared. The sound rattled slate. John leaned him in low. They took a pass over the outer yard. Dogs scattered. Men fell flat. Banners blew, the flayed man's red flapping like meat. John watched with the practical eye again, measuring distances. The stables were there, the granaries there, the place where wagons stood tarped against snow there. He felt Nocturnes' heat build, the little muscles along his spine flexing in a ripple he had begun to know. There, he said, and the dragon obeyed. Fire fell. It did not roar so much as crackle when it met the tarps, the tar bleeding and exploding into little stars that fell on wood and leapt. Pitch caught. The stable roof went up as if it had prayed for this itself. Horses screamed. John's heart clenched. But this was war, not poetry. Men ran, some with buckets, some with their hands out as if to catch what could not be caught. John took nocturies wide so his breath would fan the blaze, making a trench of heat between the inner ward and the outer that would keep the fire from swallowing men he did not mean to kill. He saw Ramsay Bolton or a man in quilted armor with an ugly smile who would do. The man shook a fist at the sky, the gesture of a child told to go to bed. The dragon banked and came along the granary, laid a neat seam of fire along the base, and rose. Snow ran in black streams off the roof and then turned to steam and then to nothing at all. Somewhere in that fog a woman laughed in surprise and then began to scream as the smoke took her. Enough! He took them higher. The wind tore at him, fighting over the smell of his own singed hair. He would not be tempted into savagery. He would not be tempted into mercy that took the shape of a second pass. They left Winterfell steaming, men looking up and saying each to each, "I saw," and none of them seeing quite the same thing. They left a threat reshaped and a story begun. They left a letter answered in a tongue that could not be mistaken. By the time they made Castle Black again, the cold had turned barbed. The sky that had been a wash of pale flags had gone to iron sheet. Bowen Marsh met him in the yard. His mouth was tight. His eyes were wet. In his hand was a knife. John had known this was coming since he had woken with his skin smelling of smoke and his hands empty of a boy's certainty. The world never failed to do what it had always done: defend itself against being changed. He saw Othel move very slightly, Tormund not move at all, Melisandre lift her chin like a woman sniffing a rare smell at market. "For the watch," Marsh said, voice shaking with too many feelings to name, and stepped forward and struck. The knife entered John under the ribs. It was not poetic. It was not even particularly painful at first, the way a cut sometimes holds off its grief until the brain has had a chance to understand it. He looked into Marsh's eyes and saw nothing worse than fear and love for a world that had slipped to the side of what it had been. Another cut came, then another. He stepped back without meaning to. The snow took him. He thought of the crypts and the blue flower. He thought of the wall singing. He thought of a woman's whisper that had nothing to do with any god, only with blood and the way it remembers itself. Heat touched his face. He looked past Marsh. Noctury stood in the yard with his wings half open, his mouth leaking thin smoke, his eyes gone wide and round as if sight were something new and alarming. Ghost's howl cut the world in two. "Easy," John said, or thought he said. He could not be sure. He lay back. The snow came up and kissed him hard. Men yelled. Some ran toward him. Some ran away. Fire bloomed above him. Not the dragons, but a held fire, demure and intent. Melisandre knelt, her hair a red flag, her hands steady as summer. "Do not go far," she said to him, as if that were a thing a man could choose. "Come back and finish what you started." John did not answer. He was already going, as a man goes down a long flight of steps in a place he has learned by heart. He went to the crypts. He smelled roses. He saw a woman's face that had not chosen its fate and hated that it had been denied the choosing. He put his hand upon the cold of her hand and found, to his infinite surprise, that it was warm. When he breathed again, it was with a fire in him that hurt more than the knives had done. He coughed and brought up black. His ribs felt like splintered kindling. He tried to sit. Hands pushed him down. The world was a storm, but he was the eye of it. He opened his own eyes. Melisandre watched him, sweat freezing at her hairline, joy and exhaustion fighting a brief battle in her gaze before both were swallowed by the flat, practical interest she wore like a profession. "Welcome," she said simply. "Was I gone long?" John asked, because he was alive and his mouth worked and men asked foolish questions when they had woken from long sleep. "A night?" Ed said from somewhere above him, sounding as if someone had stolen all his jokes and left him with grim ones. A very long night. Long enough for me to consider that if you stayed away, I'd be Lord Commander. I decided I prefer my old work. Who? John began, and Ed shook his head once. Bowen Marsh lay under a cloak nearby. His eyes were closed. No one had covered his face. His hands were folded on his chest. "Don't ask me to name who's dead," Ed said, as gently as dolorous Ed could be. "Don't ask me to celebrate who's living. I have a face for both, but only one throat, and it's sore." Nocturnes lowered his head, delicately as a cat smelling a newborn. His breath washed John. It was hot, but it did not burn. The dragon set the tip of his snout against John's bandaged hand, right over the old scar, and pressed. The heat there went deeper than skin. "Still mine," the red woman said softly. "Both of you, still mine." She smiled at John's glance. "Do not bristle. I am only a woman who watches a fire, keeps surprising me." He lived. He learned what it meant to die and be told by friends to breathe again. He learned what it meant to be free of a vow by the strictest reading of it and bound to it by everything else. He learned to ride a young dragon whose shadow grew longer every day across a world that wanted to pretend it did not live under shadows. He learned the limit of fire upon the wall. It warms. It burns. It weakens the old spells if put where the ice holds old secrets. He learned to keep Nocturnes' breath off the ice of the wall and aim it outward, always outward. In time, men would come up the King's Road to Castle Black with more letters and more reasons and more names for him. King, bastard, oathbreaker, lord, kinslayer for not saving those he could not save, prince for begetting nothing but hopes he would not fill. Some would bring banners. Some would bring knives and hide them better than Bowen had, for the world is an apt pupil. He would fly and burn and refuse crowns and accept them in men's eyes while turning them away with his hands. He would dream of blue roses and wake to the sound of the wall saying the things the wall had always said. Stand, be cold, hold. On a night when the sky had gone very clear, like glass wiped with a rag, he took Nocturnes up alone. Ghost watched from the parapet, his eyes two hot pennies. The dragon's wings pushed the world down and rose into a dome of stars so bright and many they seemed a frost. John let the cold have his face. He let the wind strip him clean of men's words. He leaned the dragon north. Above the haunted forest they saw light, cold light, not fire, a ribbon of pale green blown out of the east and caught on the hook of a mountain. It writhed like a living thing. Nocturnes hissed softly, coaxed by the sight. John put out a hand, a fool, as if he could touch it. Under him, the dragon all at once was perfectly still, wings fallen into a glide so smooth it felt like drifting sleep. He saw it then. Not the army, not the others, not the wrath or the host or the names the old men had flung about their cups. He saw the shape of the winter coming. It did not march. It pressed. It did not rage. It receded and advanced like the tide. It would not be defeated. It would be survived or it would not. He felt a strange, fierce calm. No man with a dragon ever felt calm in songs. He did now. Calm like a sword set on a table, ready and clean, while the feast raged around it. Nocturnes, he said, and the dragon's head turned to mark him, and John felt the old heat in his hand answer. He could have imagined he heard a woman's voice below the wind. He did not take comfort from it in the way boys take comfort in lullabies. He took it as a man takes a message. We will go where we are needed. We will not go willingly into halls where men would cheer our arrival and press crowns upon us. We will go to the ice. We will light the dark. We will not burn the bridge we stand on. He leaned forward. The black dragon made of heat and night and old, stubborn hope answered with his wings and fell into the long, cold arc of a flight that would draw a line between two ages. The wall hummed behind them like a harp in a sudden draft. Snow made a soft sound when it met the ground where the dragon's shadow passed. Far ahead, the light on the mountains moved as if a giant were turning in sleep. John set his mouth and rode toward the place where the night was deepest. The stars watched, each as indifferent and patient as the fate of kings. The dragon burned as little as a small sun and more than a man had any right to command. Ghost howled once, and it sounded not like grief or warning but like a prayer. And the wind took it and did with it what winds do. In the world below and behind him, men began, in ones and twos and then in squabbling clutches, to change the stories they told. Dragons were not only for conquerors, they were for keepers as well. The last egg laid in an old age had woken in the last place anyone would have thought to look for it, and it had chosen a hand with frostbite scars on it and the smell of pines in its hair. The night went on. The breath of the dragon and the breath of the rider made two trails in the air, one gilded, one invisible, both real. Eventually dawn would come. Eventually men would drink and boast and lie and tell the truth by mistake. Eventually a woman across the sea would wake and look toward a west that had been east her whole life and find it suddenly very near. For now, the fire and the cold worked their old sum without him and with him in it. The way the sea and the shore finish each other with no speech necessary. John felt the truth of it in the healed ache of his hand and in the long, sweet burn of his lungs and in the steady beat of Nocturis's heart beneath him. The wall fell away behind. The forest spread. The dead waited where they would wait until someone arranged to wake them or put them to sleep. Above them all, a man and a dragon wrote their names upon the frosted air. It was not a name to be shouted in feast halls. It was a name like a fire in winter, anonymous to the world beyond your door, and the difference between dying and keeping your children alive. Night came as it always came, with practical certainty and no cruelty at all. John went into it, eyes open, hands steady, the old words in his mouth and a new truth at his back. The black dragon breathed, and the light it made was enough.